as I say, we're honored to have George Guido here with us tonight. He's a local author as well as a journalist for the Trib. He does lots of different jobs at the Trib, right? Sports still. Used to be Remember When.
Yeah.
Are you ever going to bring that back?
I hope. I don't know. We got the football Remember When back every Friday. So,
Oh, really? I
Yeah.
didn't know that.
yeah,
Okay,
so,
great.
hopefully.
And he's published already 2 books, right? 3, I'm sorry. And then tonight, we have his new one he's gonna tell us about, which is a lot of the little local neighborhoods that have been around, and we probably all know they're there, but we don't really know the background about them, so he's gonna fill us in. And it's a pleasure, George, to have us, so begin when you like.
Okay, well, it's great to be here, and thanks everybody for coming out. We understand we have some people on Zoom joining us this evening, and that's good too. A special welcome to you. I still don't know how Zoom works. This has been going on now for almost 2 years with some of the business interests with the newspaper and some of the public service organizations I'm in. We've used Zoom, but hey, apparently it's working, and we're glad we have the people here this evening, and I'm glad to be here this evening. The main thrust of my being here this evening is my new book, Neighborhoods of the Alle-Kiski Valley, which came out less than a month ago. Now, I got a bombshell before I came over here tonight. We have 200 books that are lost on the UPS truck somewhere. So all I have is 9 books. And at the conclusion of the program, anybody would like to purchase a book, the first 9 people will be glad to accommodate you. Other than that, if you want to take orders, yeah, this one could be. Maybe I should use this podium as a barrier or something, as a protection. But sorry, hey, those things happen. I guess that's what you call logistics these days. But in case you see a UPS truck on the way home, please commandeer it. Maybe but also, the thrust of tonight, as I said, is my new book. It came out less than a month ago. Almost out of them already, so I'm thankful for that in a way. But for the people that want them, not so much. I'm the author, as Kathy mentioned, of 2 other books. This is Alle-Kiski Sports History, about sports up and down the valley, mainly with high school sports, and a lot of the schools that no longer exist, such as Harborough, Trentham, Vandergrift, Oakmont, Verona, so on and so forth. Most of this takes place in the post-World War II era, when it's sort of the heyday of high school sports around here. I also have non-high school sports mentioned in here, such as the Oakmont Country Club, Lernerville Speedway, and several other things. So that is also available. Then about 5 years ago, I put out New Kensington, the Photographic History, in conjunction with that town's 125th anniversary. And I have in here chronicled New Kensington from the start. And again, most of it is the heyday of New Kensington from the end of World War II in 1945 till about 1970 or so, when fortunes began to decline with our friends across the river there. But this book has been very well received, and I'm very appreciative of that. Likewise, my other book, and likewise what we have here so far tonight with Neighborhoods of the Alle-Kiski Valley. And timing is everything, and I picked a bad time to do a book, because with the pandemic, a lot of the museums were closed, the libraries were closed, a lot of the access to microfilm in various areas were closed, so therefore I had a difficult time putting this together. It took me longer than I'd hoped to, but I'm glad I did, and we have the finished product. And hopefully in this book, even during tonight's presentation, I hope you find out some things you don't know. Some of the biggest compliments I get, whether I'm doing a book or a sports story or whatever, a feature of some nature, when someone comes up to me and says, gee, I didn't know that. That's something new I learned, and that means a lot to me when people say that. So, hopefully you find out some things you don't know, and as we can move on with the program here this evening. What you see here is a panoramic view of Natrona Heights from the 50s, and I'm going to say it's about 1955-56, because Heights Plaza is made already, and you see the cars in the parking lot there. And of course, in the middle is Sheldon Park. It was a war defense housing project in 1941. What happened, and I'll get into that more a little later, with the outbreak of World War II, we had many industries and many jobs, particularly to supply the war effort. And the problem was there were lots of jobs, but there were not enough places for people to live. Thus, Sheldon Park was created, and across the river, which again we'll get into later, Aluminum City Terrace in New Kensington. And in the foreground here is the good old Lindane dump. Some of you may remember that along Spring Hill Road. It was a highly toxic pesticide that was dumped by Allegheny Ludlam. Now, I was just a little kid at the time, but I swear that stuff glowed at night. But it was, you know, can't prove it, but boy, when I was a little kid, and I swear it glowed. But that being said, it was finally covered up by Allegheny Ludlam, and it was called Alsco Park, Allegheny Ludlam Steel Corporation, Steel Company Park. So that's how Alasco came from. And they made a playground and ball fields out of it, but they told the kids it was too dangerous to play in the ball field there. So that's what happened there. So is widely believed the Heights Plaza to be the third shopping center built in the post-World War II era in the Pittsburgh region. The first was Cassidy Village down in Castle Shannon. The second was Miracle Mile Shopping Center in Monroeville, which predated Heights Plaza just by a couple years, and then Heights Plaza opened up. So Heights Plaza, of course, has a lot of history. And you see behind Heights Plaza towards the river, there was a blank area there. That was before Highlands High School was built. And some of you may or may not know that that was an airfield at one time. That wasn't an airport per se, but it was a drop-off for airmail. It started on October 14th, 1913. And what it was, the plane would come close to the ground and toss out the airmail, or the mail they had, in a pouch to the ground, that also at the same time pick up from an object, kind of like a loop, pick up the mail that was there already waiting for the plane.
I saw that.
Now, the first time they tried it in 1913, the plane crashed. So it wasn't exactly off to an auspicious start. But as time went on, it became to be used more. There was some recreational flying taking place there. And when the WPA came along in the 1930s, they offered a grant for an airport there, a small airport to be placed there. And they also had plans for a 4,700-foot landing strip. So that's almost a mile landing strip. So they had big plans for it. However, they needed the municipalities to back it. Harrison, Brackenridge, and Toronto. The Harrison solicitor found out that municipalities weren't allowed to sponsor airports. So they had to kind of start an airport authority. And Brackenridge had bad dealings with the federal government. They backed away, and Trentham says, hey, you know, Harrison Township and Natrona Heights is getting all the attention. What about us? So Trentham backed away, and Harrison didn't want to do it alone. So the airport was eventually closed, and now it is the site of Highlands High School and some housing, medical offices, so on and so forth. So next time you're passing by there, just remember that once upon a time there was an airport there and plans for even a bigger airport. And I know this is something that may be pleasing to a lot of you if you remember the entrance to Heights Plaza. They had the clock there and the fountain that turned colors at night. Again, I was a little kid at the time. I thought that was fascinating, that the water could turn colors, so on and so forth. And that was, of course, a big deal at the time when Heights Plaza was under construction. It's back as part of Birdville at the time. And Birdville, again, you find out things when you research. I thought there was a bunch of birds around, how they got the name Birdville, but it was actually Richard Bird that settled the area on August 7th, 1888. He purchased 12 acres of land right around the confluence of Spring Hill, Freeport, and Burtner Roads as we know them now. In 1894, John Potts bought 116 acres for a farm in a lot of the area that we formerly looked at towards Highlands High School. And Mr. Potts actually was intended to be farmland, but he had a lot of oil wells there. I don't know how successful they were, but it wasn't a farm as we would think of it now. And when Birdville first started, when the residential houses came in, they were called birdhouses at the time. So that's how kind of Birdville got its start. And the next slide is in Birdville itself, along the main drag there. The Highland Movie Theater, Hiland, was a movie theater there. And many communities at this time had their own theaters. Trentham had a couple, New Kensington and Arnold had 5 down the strip on 5th Avenue. And movie houses were a big thing then. Even in 1951, a lot of people still didn't have TV sets then, although antennas were springing up everywhere around the Alle-Kiski Valley, and in particular, what we call Birdville and Natrona Heights right now. And playing at the Highland Theater in 1951 was the movie Pandora and the Flying Dutchman. It starred Ava Gardner and James Mason. That was a 1951 movie. In 1927, February 4th, 1927 to be exact, Harrison Township Commissioners, it was called Birdville at the time, but they decided to rename it Natrona Heights, taking in a more widely expansive area than just the Birdville neighborhood. It included Campton, Pleasantville, Harrison Heights, and Harrison Place, and it all became Natrona Heights. Now, Birdville had its own post office, but when it was decreed to be Natrona Heights, they had to redo the post office and rename it the Natrona Heights Post Office. And I have a picture of it in there, but I just wanted to give you a example here of what the business district of Birdville looked like with the movie theater back in 1951. And moving on, here is Pensalt. Sometimes you forget how big of an area Pensalt covered. Pensalt went into business September 1st, 1850 as the Pennsylvania Salt Manufacturing Company. Now, before that, what we call Natrona now was known as East Trentham. It was settled between 1830 and 1832. When Pensalt came in, it was renamed Natrona. And natron is a Greek word meaning soda to express the recognition of the salt mines that were around there and the salt wells that were dug. Pensalt got its start with 2 salt wells, and within 2 years, Pensalt had 16 buildings on the grounds there. And Pensalt was into everything for a while. They had an oil refinery, they dug oil wells, they produced 75 barrels of oil a day at one time. And by 1870, the Natrona neighborhood had 3,000 people. And of course, everybody who worked at Pensalt had to shop at the company store, and Pensalt gave them $2 books of 5 and 10 cent stamps. And you went to the company store to purchase your groceries and other goods for the week, and don't you dare even think about going to another place other than the company store. By the time World War II came around, Pensalt, the salt mines had more or less dried up. They got out of the oil business. They were also in the coal business. They made hydrofluoric acid. And this was important in World War II during the Manhattan Project, where the development of the atomic bomb took place. That was one of the ingredients for the atomic project, the hydrofluoric acid. An interesting thing, it was found during wartime that a German submarine was captured off the coast of Long Island. And when our troops went in there to confiscate what was in the submarine, there was a priority list of what had the Nazis been able to land, what they wanted to destroy and what they wanted to disrupt in our military supply process. And right up at the top of the list was the Pennsylvania Salt Company in Natrona, Pennsylvania. They thought if they blew that up, that would disrupt the war process, and little did of supplying war materials, and little did anybody know at the time that that was actually where some of the studies and components were made to develop the nuclear bomb. So we could say that good old Pensalt and Natrona was #1 on the Nazi hit list back then.
Aaron.
And they didn't have the House of the Rising Sun in Natrona. Got into that sort of thing. Here is the Adler Street coal mine tunnel. in Natrona, and I mentioned Pensalt got into the coal mining business for a time. Pensalt was very much ahead of its time as they diversified into other industries and the production of other goods. And one of the other items too, besides the coal mine, was they made lye, caustic soda, which was converted fats, oil, and lipid into soap by a heating process. So you can kind of take credit for the invention of cake soap around here. Before that, people just made homemade soup themselves with caustic potash. It was considered a luxury at the time to be able to have cakes of soap in your house. And the Pensalt, again, got a tract of land along the Clarion River. They dug 200 oil wells. Only 74 of the wells produced any oil, so Pensalt was kind of discouraged after that, and they got out of the oil business. They concentrated on chemicals as the salt wells, the oil wells, and the coal mine, which you see here, was depleted. We had the privilege of many great inventors in the AK Valley, and one of them is pictured here, Samuel M. Keir. In my New Kensington book, I talked about a lady who invented, by accident more or less, Kevlar, which is the material used in police bulletproof vests. And you know, she was an inventor of that, and they have a memorial to her over in New Kensington. But to stay on the subject here of Samuel M. Kerr, his family came from Ireland, and the first salt well was dug in an area called Charlesville. How many people have ever heard of Charlesville? Gentleman here has? Well, naturally you have all the history in your back pocket there. But Charlesville was a little town located, I guess the best we could say is between Natrona and Carnes, what we call the Carnes neighborhood. It obviously no longer exists, but it was settled in 1798, being one of the oldest neighborhoods settled on this side of the river. Now, the first salt well was dug by a man by the name of Albert Bolus. It was 200 feet deep. And why was salt important? It was considered a luxury. You take the era during the American Revolutionary War, salt went for $8 a bushel. It was a luxury. $8 a bushel during the Revolutionary War now is worth $226 or $226 a bushel in 2021 dollars. So you see how expensive salt was at the time. So when they dug the salt wells around here, it became very common for people to be able to have salt. Also, during the pioneer days, you of course didn't have refrigerators or even ice boxes, so a lot of the pioneers stored their food in underground compartments covered with salt to be able to preserve the food. And what happened in 1849, when the oil wells, or salt wells were being dug, oil began to seep out. And the workers complained that they have this junk coming out of the ground that's interfering with their salt digging. Little did anybody know that that would become just about the biggest industry in the world. People have died and fought wars over it, but at first oil was kind of like a nuisance. And it began to seep into the wells, and Samuel Keir here, discovered a process he sent to a professor at a university in Philadelphia to see what he could do with it. And the professor in Philadelphia saw that there was a refining process that could take place where you could take the oil, refine it, and put it into lamps and light a lamp for your house. This is, of course, before the light bulb was invented. And a lot of times people lit their houses by candles. You know, with a lot of wooden houses and wooden rugs and everything like that, boy, the candle fell over, you were done. So they wanted to get a replacement for candle, and with the distilled oil, they found something capable of lighting an individual's home. So that's one of the things that Samuel Keir was called Keir's rock oil, was invented at the time. His mother and father were very prominent in the settlement of Salina, which I also have in my book. That is a small community along the Kiski River between Apollo, or Avonmore, and Salzburg, is the best way to describe it. But again, Salina is just filled with history. And also, Samuel Keir settled in Charlesville And Charlesville had its own hotel. This was a big time town at one point. Lumbermen would come down the Allegheny River, particularly in the spring when the river was higher. And they would gather, maybe 150, 200 logs together and float down with the logs along the Allegheny. And it took so long to get from what we know now as the Allegheny National Forest into Pittsburgh that they needed an overnight stay, and thus the Charlesville Hotel became very, very prominent. So we're talking like millions of feet of lumber each year coming through in the trunk.
If you want a water.
Would be good, thank you. Next, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the Pittsburgh Trentham Campgrounds, not too far from here. Campground started in 1849 on land leased from Judge Breckenridge and his son, Benjamin. It was a 14-acre area. And when they were built in 1849, the purpose of it was for people in Pittsburgh and the surrounding area to get away from the noise and the grime and the smoke of the industrial era at the time. So they found an area up here in Harrison Township. The Methodist Church operated it, and by the time they got it started, by the mid-1850s, there were 5,000 people coming with regularity and staying under a tent for religious services. It got to 6,000 in 1856, and there were 90 tents in the area. There were some cottages, but basically these were people staying for the weekend for religious services, 90 tents. And getting from Pittsburgh to here at that time, that was probably the toughest part. People would come up, thanks Cindy, by way of riverboat. And they would get off and make their way up by way of horse and buggy from the river to the campgrounds. Now in 1865 was a big deal because the railroads were put in here on this side of the Allegheny from Pittsburgh up to Oil City. So the people coming up to the campgrounds were able to use the railroads to get there. And when they landed in Trentham, they were taken from Trentham, where the railroad station is, to the campgrounds by people called hacks, people that had their own horse and buggy. And a hack ride cost 15 cents to go from Trentham to the campgrounds, and 15 cents then is translated into $2.40 now. And right here is the hotel built on the campgrounds back in 1905. But backtracking a little bit, 1876 there was a fire that more or less destroyed the campgrounds and what they had. There were 117 cottages at the time. They were rebuilt a few years later. The people loved coming up here so much that they rebuilt them, and in fact they built a pavilion. They also had a playground installed. In 1911 another fire occurred. It wasn't as serious as the first one, but again they were rebuilt, as they say, bigger and better than ever. Social hall there was built in 1955. And at one time they had a pool. It was a Cool Springs pool fed by the springs coming out of the hillside.
It was cold.
And they said it was more or less fit for polar bears.
Really?
Around 1950, they put in the above ground pool that's there now. And most of the people coming and staying there for the summer are what we call snowbirds. They stay in the winter in Florida, South Carolina, and so on, and they come up here and spend the summer. And in 1976, the bylaws were changed to allow other denominations than Methodists to come and enjoy the area there. But right there is the hotel that was built in 1905. And on the screen now is Nellie Bly. I don't know how many of you know that she came from this area. She was born in a place called Cochrane Mills, and her father was the Cochrane in Cochrane Mills. However, if you're looking for Cochrane Mills today, you're pretty much out of luck because it is covered by the Crooked Creek Reservoir. But before Crooked Creek was put in, again, Cochrane Mills, was a big time town. Elizabeth Cochran was born on May 5th, 1864. Now they have her birth date wrong on that millstone. The millstone you see on the right-hand side of the screen is about a quarter of a mile from the municipal building up in Burrell Township, where most of Crooked Creek is located. Most of it has been covered by Crooked Creek. I think their population fell by about 2/3 in Burrell Township when Crooked Creek was put in. But at any rate, her father, Michael Cochran, started a sawmill there and a grist mill that he took over in 1859. 10 years earlier, in 1849, Mr. Cochran opened the first store in the area. And he did everything up there. He was a justice of the peace, he was a storekeeper, he had about 3 or 4 duties, so he wore a bunch of hats. And at the same time, he was studying law. He became an attorney, and the family moved to Apollo, where more of the action was. And I have a picture in the book where she grew up for part of her teenage years in Apollo. And Elizabeth was always interested in reading. She was a very studious sort of person. She was accepted at Indiana Normal, which today we call Indiana University of Pennsylvania. However, after a year there, her father died. And naturally she had to quit college because the mother had no means to support the family, let alone have her continue in college study. So they moved to Pittsburgh. She was reading a newspaper one day, and the man who wrote the newspaper, the editor, George Madden, wrote an editorial that women shouldn't be worried about getting into new professions. They should be nurses and school teachers like women were intended to be. Well, Elizabeth Cochran saw that editorial, and she fired off a letter to the editor, to Mr. Madden, to tell him her feelings. Mr. Madden was so impressed by her writing the editorial that he hired her as a news reporter for $5 a week. She quickly began to rise in the journalistic world, and she moved to New York City and took a job with the New York World. And she did things that were just so groundbreaking in journalism at the time. For instance, and by the way, by then she had received the pen name of Nellie Bly for her journalistic purposes. But Nellie Bly faked a mental illness and got into Blackwell Island Asylum up around New York City. She went there undercover for 10 days and chronicled everything and wrote about the abuses of mental patients in that era. And because of that, various laws and regulations were formed to protect patients in mental institutions, thanks to the work of Nellie Bly. Also, one thing Nellie Bly is famous for, the Jules Verne book, Around the World in 80 Days. She took the challenge to get around the world in 80 days. She actually completed the journey in 72 days. But it sounds better to say, alliteratively to say around the world in 80 days, as opposed to around the world in 72 days. But she did that in 72 days. And the editor of the New York World at the time was Joseph Pulitzer, the man for whom the journalistic prizes are named for this day. And her career wasn't quite over yet. She married Robert L. Seaman, a man who was 42 years older than her. He was a businessman in New York City, and they had a plant, a manufacturing plant there. Then he didn't live too long, as you might expect with their difference in age, and she took over the organization. And it was very forward-thinking at the time. At the plant there, she had daycare, a bowling alley, and health care was offered to employees for 50 cents a month, compared to what we're paying our friends at Blue Cross and so on now. 50 cents a month got you some great health care in New York City. However, there was an embezzlement by her employees, and they had to shut down. But her career wasn't quite over yet. She was in Austria, vacationing, when World War I broke out. So she couldn't get away, couldn't get back here. So the New York World said, well, why don't you be our correspondent there and report on what's going on in World War I? So she became the first female war correspondent that's known in history. And she died at a rather young age 57, in 1922. She was buried in the Bronx section of New York City, a very modest grave. But as the years went on and people realized who she was and what she did, she began to gather many admirers. Those admirers got together and in 1978 turned her modest grave into a nice monument on the burial grounds, which I have illustrated in the book here. And not too many years ago, in her hometown of Burrell Township, up there around Crooked Creek, they have a millstone in her honor. Even though the birth date is wrong, it was very good of them to recognize perhaps the main person in that town. And by the way, Burrell Township, along with Lower Burrell across the river and Upper Burrell across the river, those communities get their name from Jeremiah Murray Burrell, who was a judge in Westmoreland County. At the time, the judges didn't only have Westmoreland County, they had Armstrong County and up towards Indiana County. And so the municipality of Burrell Township was named after Judge Jeremiah Murray Burrell. And by the way, his grandmother on his maternal grandmother on his mother's side, her husband was Jeremiah Murray, M-U-R-R-Y. In the late 1700s, that is the man for whom the town of Murraysville is named. And let's get out over the hill here to Laneville, adjacent to Freeport. We have a chapter on Laneville. Laneville was founded by Abner Lane in 1842 when he purchased 150 acres of land. At the time, it was South Buffalo Township. And Mr. Lane died in 1868, and his attorney, on his behalf, John Boyd, actually laid out the streets that we now see in their configuration down in Laneville. Freeport annexed Laneville from South Buffalo Township on April 18th, 1964, but long before that, it became famous for mills. Like you see pictured here, it was called Mickey's Mill. It was founded by Elmer C. Mickey. Now, Mr. Mickey's family came over to the United States in 1718. Still during the colonial days, they come over from Ireland. And Mr. Mickey, in his generation, he started the grist mill. It was called the Valley Grist Mill at the time. He sold the facility there to his son Merrill in 1942. And as time went on, Merrill had no family members that wanted to take over the mill. And by that time, in 1965, basically all they were doing, they had milled flour for about 100 years. But by the time the 60s came around, they were just grinding grain into animal feed. So they closed the facility in 1965. They built, as you probably know, a new bridge there in 2013 to connect Laneville with the main portion of Freeport. And a big deal up there took place in 1888 when the railroad was laid from Freeport to Butler. And there was a time, in 1911, there were 7 passenger trains a day going from Freeport to Butler. That's hard to believe now. There were 5 on Sundays, so they didn't take Sunday off. But finally, the railroad went out of business, and they used the rail bed, as many of you might know, for the Butler-Freeport Trail, which has become a very, very popular place for recreation. It opened in 1992 and was completed not too long ago in 2015. So the Butler-Freeport Trail is, in fact, where the trail was now and has become very, very popular with a lot of people. And something I didn't know, I thought Buffalo Township was named after buffalo that probably roamed the area then. Instead, Buffalo Township gets its name from an Indian chief named Buffalor, B-U-F-F-A-L-O-R. So that's how, and they contracted that into Buffalo Township. So that's how Buffalo Township got its name. Yeah, who knew? That's why we're here. And going across the river to the neighborhood of Kinloch, which is part of Lower Burrell, although you don't think of it as being part of Lower Burrell. You think of Lower Burrell around where Hillcrest Shopping Center is and Leechburg Road and so on and so forth. But Kinloch was in fact part of Lower Burrell, and at the time in early 1900s, Henry Kinloch, for whom the community is named for, was the head of the Valley Camp Coal Company. They had coal mines in Valley Camp directly pretty much underneath the Trenton Bridge now towards the Valley Camp area of New Kensington. They also had a mine portal in Kinloch. In 1925, they were digging tons of coal out of there. They were producing 1 million tons of coal a year, and they had 800 employees. And on February 14th, 1928, it wasn't a very good Valentine's Day, there was an explosion at the mine. And 34 men were killed. Many were entombed. They were never able to get to them, so that is more or less their place of burial. And mine opened back up, but on March 14th, 1929, there was a major explosion, as you often had in these coal patch towns. 129 men were killed with the explosion. They believe there were more than 129 because at the time you had immigrants from Eastern and Central Europe coming over, and they got a job in the mine, and there really wasn't, they were paid cash, and there really wasn't any trace or track that they were there. They may have come over by themselves from Europe, and there was no record of them even being in the mine, but it's widely believed that there are more than 129 people who died in the coal mine. And the explosion was so violent that it cracked some of the homes, including an apartment complex near the Kinloch mine. They had landslides, and they reopened the mine eventually, but production slacked off, and finally in 1936, the mine closed. The homes there, owned by the Valley Camp Coal Company, were auctioned off to residents in the area we now know as Kinloch. And where the coal mine tipple was in the back, right now, Greensburg Road in 1939 was built over the tipple. So when you go along Greensburg Road, PA Route 366 to some of us, when you pass by the Kinloch Fire Hall on the main road there, you're passing by where the tipple was located. So that's how Kinloch got its name, and that's more or less tragic circumstances that occurred in many of the coal patch neighborhoods here in the Alle-Kiski Valley. And something I bet some of us didn't know, Henry Ford had big time plans for the Alle-Kiski Valley. Right in the small community of Glassmere, part of East Deer Township. As soon as you get across the New Kensington Bridge from the other side and down from the where the Sheets used to be in Creighton, down toward the New Kensington Bridge is the community of Glassmere. It was founded by the Glassmire brothers, Glasmire. They came from area northeast of France near the Belgiumese border. They came to the United States. And before we talk about Henry Ford, there was another person named Ford, Captain John B. Ford, the founder of the town of Ford City. And why we're backtracking there, Captain Ford, another industrialist at the time, discovered that the sand along the banks of the Allegheny River was very conducive to glass making. That's where the plant came along in Ford City, down here in Creighton, which we later became known as PPG Glass. PPG also had a plant located in Trenham at where Bull Creek meets the Allegheny River on the other side of what's now the Trenham Bridge. PPG had a plant there that had a fire, and they ended up closing it and taking down the remainder of the building itself. But Henry Ford knew about the glass making possibilities here. Came to Glassmere, bought a plant there, and had big plans. He wanted to build windshields and windows for his automobiles that he was assembling in Detroit. At the time, we're talking 1921, 22, 23, there were plans on building a canal through the Allegheny River, through the upper Allegheny to French Creek and meeting with Lake Erie. And Henry Ford said, this is great. I could come down, use the sand along the banks of the river, make glass, my windshields and car windows, ship them up through French Creek, the upper Allegheny Valley, into Lake Erie, and take them to the plant in Dearborn, Michigan, and help assemble his cars. And Henry Ford, he had everything planned out. He owned iron ore ranges in Minnesota. He owned a rubber plantation in Brazil. So everything he did with his automobile, he owned and was related to him. He didn't have to worry about these supply chains where those ships are stuck outside Long Beach. Henry Ford had his own thing going. It was interesting, at one time, his River Rouge plant outside of Detroit near Dearborn, they had 100,000 people working there at one time. prior to World War II. And it was just amazing. And again, a lot of people resettled to the Detroit area because they just needed workers. They were doing so well. But eventually, the Great Depression came along, and remnants of World War II were starting, and it became apparent that the government wouldn't be able to put the canal in from the Alle-Kiski Valley up to Lake Erie. So Henry Ford sold his interest in 1935. He sold his plant there. Later became Glassmere Castings for a while, and Henry Ford sold off what you call the Ford houses here. Some of them still exist along Freeport Road in Glassmere. You see the unique roofs. They were called Dutch roofs at the time, and some of them were duplexes. And some neighborhoods, they have zoning laws, single-family dwellings, duplexes, multi-family dwellings. But Henry Ford, zoning wasn't an issue. He went and built his houses wherever he wanted to, whichever way he wanted to. And that was one of the reasons he was successful. But a lot of these homes still exist, and they're well kept, and that's a testament to their owners. The man who was in charge of auctioning off the homes got all the homes auctioned off within one day. They're all, and the people wanted to live there. It's a nice area, so the people more or less bought the homes that they were living in that Henry Ford had built for them. And we're moving upriver now to the town of Shenley, a little neighborhood where the Kiski River meets the Allegheny River up in Gilpin Township. And Shenley is best known, of course, for its distillery. It was opened in 1888 on the Allegheny side of what we now know of Kiski Junction, where the two rivers meet. And what they found when the family came over to start the distillery, they found an aquifer underneath Shenley where they used fresh water for the distillery. So again, they found that the water they had in the ground along the Allegheny was very conducive to distilling. In Shenley, it really took off. At one time, they had 65 buildings on 60 acres of land. And there you see the way it looked in 1975. Now, things were thriving, but in 1919, guess what comes along? Prohibition. Cindy earlier referred to a feature I used to have on Mondays in the Valley News Dispatch when we had a living section called Remember When. And I would do 100 years ago this week, 50 years ago this week, 25 years ago this week, and so on. And I noticed in the year 2017, 2018, when I was doing the 100 years ago this week thing, that there was a temperance movement to ban liquor. And a lot of preachers were involved, and a lot of churches were involved, and people thought, how could you ever ban alcoholic beverages? That's crazy. But as I went along from week to week, they would start out with maybe New Kensington, a meeting of 6 people. In Apollo, they'd have maybe 12 people. In fact, they had a Women's Christian Temperance Union building up in Apollo where their historical society is now. And then you look a few months later, there would be 100 at a meeting, 200. And eventually, as we got into 1918, there were 600 people coming to these temperance meetings. And people thought, boy, this might be able to fly. And I noticed in one of the passages, they said there were 600 people at one temperance meeting, and 200 men signed a petition vowing they would not vote for a politician running for office unless he was sworn to ban alcohol. And I'm thinking to myself, that's nice, all the men, but what about the women that were there? And I realized this was 1918. Women did not have the right to vote yet. So that's why they didn't sign the petition. Anyhow, the amendment came along in 1919, so obviously hard times came to Shenley. They were able to make, again, some alcohol, some non-alcoholic types of beverages there. So they were able to stay in business, but it wasn't quite the same until Prohibition was done away with in 1933. So they began to thrive again. And World War II came along. And what happened, they took a lot of their production into what we would call war alcohol. This would be a fluid to help make rubber. You know, we were not self-sufficient in the United States in rubber during World War II. We had a gasoline rationing, and it wasn't because we didn't have enough gasoline, it was because we couldn't make enough rubber to keep up with the demand, so people were only allowed to buy X number of gallons of gasoline in a given week or a given month, and you were given coupons at the time that you were used when you went to get gas, and there wasn't much of it then, and there were other rationing going on, but the most important thing was the gasoline and travel rationing. And when they got into the making of war alcohol, again, the Nazis said, you know, we gotta take care of this plant and disrupt their production of war alcohol. So they had some infiltrate the United States here. They ended up in New York City. There was 4 of them. One of their commands, or one of their goals, was to blow up the Horseshoe Curve out near Altoona. They figured if they blew up the Horseshoe Curve, that would take away a lot of the war alcohol, steel making, war materials, tanks, and so on that were being built in the Pittsburgh area. They would disrupt the flow toward New York City and get them overseas, the Atlantic, to where the war was taking place. Well, it turned out these 4 guys, they saw what the American lifestyle was. They met up with some, what do we call, ladies of the evening, perhaps, the best way of putting it, in New York City, and they saw all the partying and the alcohol, you know, prohibition that just ended a few years earlier, and they kind of enjoyed the American way of life, so they forgot about blowing up the Horseshoe Curve and coming over to Shenley to blow up the war alcohol plant. It didn't take them long to get Americanized. But the point was also, right across the river in South Buffalo Township was an area called Duck Hollow. And we had artillery. We had 4 men, 24 hours a day, watching artillery guns just in case they got to Shenley and they could perhaps knock them off there. So during the war years, we had people stationed, a handful of people 24 hours a day in South Buffalo Township. Shenley gets its name from Mary Cochran Shenley, who grew up in Pittsburgh, but her father owned just tons and tons of property. And Mary Shenley, when she became what we would call today going to high school, girls from wealthy families at that time went to what was called finishing school. So her father, Mr. Colonel Cochran, sent her up to finishing school in Staten Island. The lady, Mrs. McLeod, who ran finishing school, had a husband from England, Captain Edmund Wyndham Shenley. Mary Cochran was just 15 at the time. Captain Shenley was 42 years older than him. Now, I don't know what this was with these girls back then, marrying these guys who were 30, 40 years older than them. But she eloped with Captain Shenley. He went to England. The father found out about it back in Pittsburgh, and he fainted, according to newspaper reports at the time. So and I guess this guy had a lot of juice. He went down to Washington, D.C. and demanded that the U.S. Congress send somebody over to intercept that ship and make her come back home. Well, that didn't happen. And he went to the Pennsylvania legislature, and he got them to make kind of a law or regulation of some sort about girls going off with all these older guys. But it was at that time now we didn't have TMZ or Inside Hollywood or anything like that. But this for the 1800s was a big scandal with young Mary making her way and eloping with Colonel Shenley over to England. And at the time, the newspaper reports just blasted them, even over in England. So this was a scandal on both sides of the Atlantic. And the newspapers in the London area, blasted him for marrying a young woman. In fact, at the time, Queen Victoria wouldn't even meet with them. People were so aghast at what was going on. Well, naturally, Colonel Shenley, died at an age where, Mary Shenley was still a young person. And she inherited all her father's property. And she wanted to start giving away her property because she was over in England and she really didn't have anybody to watch her property. So she was giving a bunch away in what we know now as the Oakland section of Pittsburgh. They wanted to build a park, and the guy who was the public works director of Pittsburgh wanted a park there instead of commercial and housing development. His name was Edward Bigelow. And Mr. Bigelow figured, I'm gonna go to England and talk to Mary Shinley, see if she'd donate land so we could build a park. Well, it turned out the developer found out. So he, 2 days later, took a ship over to England to try to chase Edward Bigelow over. Well, Edward Bigelow got there first. He got to Mary Shinley and convinced her to build a park there and convinced her to dedicate a lot of her land to recreation. So we now have Shenley Park in the Oakland section of Pittsburgh, and they also named Shenley High School, the property it was on at the time, after Mary Shenley. So Mary Shenley's name lives on despite her 19th century scandal. And next, nice little community of Russellton. And what you see here is an elementary school. And at the time, when schools were made out of wood, we had some tragedies where schools would catch on fire. Over in Lower Borough, they have what's now up on top of 7th Street Road. For instance, they had, a teacher was burning papers out in the yard, the schoolyard, and sparks flew and the school caught fire. This is what you had a lot of times then. So you notice what they had here was fire escapes. You see on your screen here. So just in case the school caught fire, the kids in the second story might have been able to jump out and get in these little cylinders and get to the ground safely. And I'm sure the kids that these elementary school kids thought, boy, this really looks like fun. So you wonder how many of them actually, without any fires occurring, would sneak and get on those little cylinders there to slide down to the ground. But that's what they did with schools then. And Russellton, again, another coal patch town, was named after Russell Love in 1905. Russell Love came over with his family as settlers, his father and mother. And at the time, Russellton was known as Gray's Mill, G-R-A-Y''S. They obviously had a mill there. And the big time for Russellton was in 1884 when coal was discovered there. They discovered a very rich vein of coal. It wasn't mined at first. At the time, people were using coal for their personal purposes in their homes, heat their homes, have their food cooked daily over a coal stove and so on. But when they began to continuously drilling and discovered this rich vein of coal, they opened a coal mine. And another big thing that happened in Russellton was 1896 when the Pittsburgh, Bessemer, and Lake Erie Railroad was laid. And this was very important. At the time, Russellton had coal, Harwick had coal, there were a lot of places that had coal. The railroad went up to Lake Erie and they brought in iron ore from the ranges in Minnesota. And they were able to, Andrew Carnegie more or less laid the railroad, and it went from Lake Erie through Saxonburg, Russellton, Harwick, across the river into the Bessemer area of Penn Hills, all the way down to East Pittsburgh where Andrew Carnegie's mills were along the Mon River Valley. So it was a very important artery to get materials to the steel mills along the Mon River Valley. So Russellton set up their community at that point, and Russellton had several other mines, several other mining communities such as Curtisville, which we have in here, Calmerville, and Bairdford, of course, had coal mines for a while there. They didn't have coal mines very long in that neighborhood, but many people immigrated from Eastern Europe and came over to Russellton to get jobs in the coal mines there. In 1946, just in the town of West Deer alone, there were 1,000 people working in the coal mines. By 1984, the coal was all dug out. Republic Steel, which owned the last mine in that area, closed in '84. So by 1984, there were no coal miners in West Deer Township. And next we go to another town along the Allegheny River, Logansport, which no longer exists. It was between Kelly Station and Ford City along the Allegheny River. And again, a man named Mr. Logan started a distillery there. He made rye whiskey in 1892. And again, the groundwater, the spring water they found was very conducive to distilling. So they had a lot of famous brands there, the Logan brand, and what you see on the screen here, the Guggenheimer brand, which was known worldwide, Pennsylvania Straight Rye Whiskey. And I love this label. It was, I got a picture of what the label was like on the whiskey. It says, "Try this whiskey today at once." You know, like the whiskey was going to walk away if you didn't try it, but that's the way the advertising was. Now, yes, try this whiskey today or right now. So in 1904, there were several hundred workers there. They had their own post office, they had their own general store, and of course the temperance group people came along, and Prohibition started, and the plant more or less made soft drinks and that sort of thing. But by 1933, when Prohibition was repealed, it began again a very historic and prosperous time in the community of Logansport. But finally, in 1938, there was a fire at the plant, and the warehouses burned down, so there's nowhere to store the whiskey. So the place went out of business. Now, later on, the Shenley people came up there and built warehouses to store their whiskey. But at the time, Logansport would then decline. By 1970, there were only about 25 residents in Logansport, and right now it's kind of next to nothing. There are some remnants of the distillery there, but Rosebud Mining has an operation there along the tracks right at the riverfront, and they are still mining coal up in that area, but that's about all there is with Logansport. And it's, by the way, called the town that booze built. I don't know if you want that sobriquet for your community, but the Logansport people love it. One thing I was lucky to do with this book is to have a drone pilot that I know, Stephen Adams, take some drone photos. I have a handful of drone photos here. And what we're seeing is the Aluminum City Terrace in New Kensington, the way it looked in March of this year. Now, the Aluminum City Terrace was built in New Kensington again in 1941, when the winds of war were starting to blow everywhere, although we didn't get into war till late in 1941. Everybody kind of knew at the time that it was only when, not if, that we would get involved in World War II. But in 1940, if you can believe this, there were 7,500 people in the New Kensington area working in the Alcoa plants. We're talking the main plant on the riverfront there, the old research plant on top of the hill in New Kensington, and the powder works in the Logan's Ferry section of Plum Borough, just outside the city of New Kensington. And again, they had a problem. They didn't have enough housing for the workers. And it became apparent they were even going to need more workers. They built the multi-family dwellings, which we know as the Aluminum City Terrace. And the people fought it at the time because New Kensington only had single-family dwellings at the time, and they thought building these apartments or multi-family housing units was going to destroy the values of the property. That didn't take place, and after Pearl Harbor, when World War II broke out, all of a sudden the opposition went, but it was too late. The mayor of New Kensington was defeated in 1941 because of his support for this multi-family housing. At the end of World War II, when the economy turned from a wartime economy to more of a commercial economy that we're more accustomed to now, they were going to rip down the Aluminum City Terrace. And the people said, wait a minute, we like living here. And they said, no, you have so many months to vacate and go find somewhere else to live. And the people persisted, and they had a team of attorneys that they signed on with. And they had very complicated negotiations with the U.S. War Department, which we now know as the Defense Department. And they finally came to an agreement where those people could live there. They're still thriving, 75, almost 80 years now after World War II, and they still live in the homes. There's been some renovations done, but more or less, it's just the way it was in the early 1940s when these were built. And that's been a very successful neighborhood. And from what I understand, there's still a waiting list to get in there. People still find that to be an enjoyable place to live. So it's still going great guns today. And I have a couple of other, I have a drone photo of Laneville in here. I have a drone photo of Lincoln Beach. I don't know how many of you ever heard that. Lincoln Beach is along Greensburg Road. It was specifically started by Mr. Fred Broad, who parceled off his land to African American citizens who for the first time had a chance to own property in their lives. And I have a drone photo of Lincoln Beach and a chapter in here talking about Lincoln Beach. And another place, I mentioned Harwick and Laneville are two other places I have drone photographs of. So I think it's nice that you can see sort of these neighborhoods in a different way, such as Aluminum City Terrace. So thank you very much. Enjoyed being here.
Thank you.
Anyone have a question?
Or anybody see a UPS truck riding around?
Oh, that's
George,
wonderful.
where will your books be available once they're in the area?
Well, a couple of things. More than anything else, they'll be available at Costello's Printing in Trent.
Oh, okay.
You go down there and buy them at some point. Now, some of you, presuming, the books I have now will be sold tonight, what I can do is, take your name and contact you when the books come in. If you want me to sign one for you, we could, meet somewhere, or I could sign one for you, and you can go to Costello's and pick it up, whatever you prefer there. But the main thing is that we're going to get those in at any time. I've heard that song before. What I did, I had to really go get another printing place, and I'm finding out too, that all the trials and tribulations of getting this book out on the streets. A lot of the print shops during the pandemic were closed. There just wasn't a lot of business. So the ones that opened up are now backlogged, and some of the other ones, you can't get supplies. Now, apparently, even though I've made 3 books, there's a certain type of paper and a certain type of ink you use to, you're in the library business, Kathy, you would perhaps know more than me, but there's a certain type of ink and a certain type of paper you need to create a book, and those are in short supply right now. So who knows when that'll come along, but it's been, let me say it's been a very difficult journey in some respects, but I'm glad I'm here tonight, and I hope you enjoyed tonight's presentation.
Question over here.
Yes.
Over
Yes,
here.
No, I just wondered, are you going to be at Central Church at the end of November
Yes.
as one of the authors?
Yes, I will. Yeah, we're having what's called a gathering of authors. It will take place at the Central Presbyterian Church down in Trentham on Sunday, the 28th. I think it's from 2 to 5.
That's correct.
Okay. And there will be myself and perhaps up to 10 other local authors there. We used to have a thing that Costello's Printing, the Word Association, sponsored for several years called a gathering of authors. We would get together maybe at a library. The last several years we were down in Oakmont on the riverfront there at one of the banquet halls. We've had to cancel that the last 2 years because of the pandemic. We were thinking of having an outside one, but that never materialized. But Dave Rankin, who has been front and center in some of the renovation of the Trentham Business District, he's going to sponsor it. So on the 28th, I will be down in Trentham from 2 to 5 at the Central Presbyterian Church with many other authors. Also on Wednesday the 1st, the People's Library of New Kensington, I'll be doing strictly a Zoom thing. They're not having in-person presentations such as this. And on Thursday, December 2nd, I will be at the Bloser Mansion in the Parnassus area of New Kensington, right along the track. So they now have a restaurant, and I will be there from 5 until 8 on Thursday, December 2nd. So if you don't have an opportunity to touch base with me tonight, I will be at those other events. Cindy.
I just wanted to say, if you want me to take down the names and telephone numbers of the people that want a book.
Okay, I mean, I was thinking, yeah, here.
I can do that for you.
Let's do that. If anybody wants to buy